My name is Trina Scully, Events Manager for the Greater Saskatoon Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber team and many of you are participating today from Saskatoon, which is situated on Treaty 6 of the Métis people. As a chamber, we are committed to growing Saskatoon rooted in shared success, respectful relationships, and truth and reconciliation. If you are joining us from other parts of the province today, a warm welcome to you and thanks for being here. This is our Power Up event series, which features industry experts who can provide chamber members with real-world tips and tools and give their businesses a boost. Today's format is simple. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the chat and Brett will call on you to ask your question. Our featured speaker today is Brett Elmgren, the president and founder of Axom Leadership, Inc., an HR management consulting organization specializing in leadership development, talent management strategy, and organizational culture. His work focuses on supporting leaders to find personal empowerment to drive transformational change. Brett is a chartered professional in human resources with over 13 years of professional HR experience and working for Saskatchewan's largest organizations, which include Federated Co-op, Cameco, Nutrien. Most recently, Brett held the position Director of Talent Management for Nutrien, and he played a senior leadership role in bringing together the merger between Potash Corp and Agrium, resulting in the creation of Nutrien. Brett holds a master's degree in leadership from Royal Roads University and an undergraduate degree from the University of Saskatchewan. It is my pleasure to welcome Brett, and now I'll pass it over to him. Thanks.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Trina, for the warm welcome. I'm going to just switch over to my slides here. So if everything works well, the technology should be coming through. And I think we've got a small but mighty group on the line here today. And I think we're all set. So actually, Trina, do you mind giving me just a thumbs up if my slides are coming through? Yeah, perfect. All right. The hardest part's over. Well, it's nice being here with you all, and especially to support the chamber. You mentioned my background, and I just started out. So I spent the last 13 years internal with companies such as Federated Co-op, Cameco, and then the last 8 years with Potash Corp / Nutrien, and then finally decided last April, after way too many years of thought, to branch out and chase a dream that I've always had, to start doing some speaking more broadly than just one organization. And that's always a risky move. But the chamber literally gave me my first home. And I joke about that, but it's actually serious because I needed an office outside of the home and was looking, and there happened to be a sublease option with the old chamber building, and based on a bit of a connection was able to find my way into there. And so actually, you literally gave me my first home. And so it's nice to be back with you and know that you'll always kind of have a special place about First Family when I think about my entrepreneurial journey. So great being here with you all. And today I want to talk about a topic I'm super passionate about, which is leadership and psychological safety, and ultimately how we are able to demonstrate actions and behaviors that drive optimal performance within our organizations. But before we do that, I just want to get into a few things to begin. And so a land acknowledgement. So Trina, I appreciate you mentioning that we sit here on Treaty 6 territory. I'm based out of Saskatoon, and that's the traditional homeland of the Métis. And a good friend of mine, her name is Lisa Mooney, has always encouraged me when talking about land acknowledgements to spend just a moment reflecting on what treaty means to me. And to me, it's photos like this. And so I'll just explain it, and it helps kind of give a bit of background about me as well. So I've got 2 daughters here. There's a third one because their friend was over. And then the neighbor's dog managed to find his way into our backyard and found an old Frisbee, I guess, underneath a tree or something, or buried in the snow. And a spontaneous snowball fight broke out. And I remember standing in my living room, looking out back and kind of laughing while I watched the madness ensue. And just thinking to myself, well, if that's not a pure moment of joy and happiness, I don't really know what is. And it happened to be on one of those days where it was actually tolerable to be outside, unlike today. And it got me reflecting on land acknowledgements and thinking about what treaty means to me. And to me, it's really moments like this. It's moments of joy and happiness that can be shared with family out in nature. And none of that's possible if it wasn't for the spirit of treaty and our shared history that allow us to share in the benefit of the land upon which we all are situated, and that we have the benefits to engage with. And so I just wanted to share that. And as you consider land acknowledgements within your organization or at speaking events in the future, give some consideration to that question. What does treaty mean to you? And what are those moments that you're grateful for as a result of our shared history? And to me, that's reflected in that photo. But I'm curious as well how you're doing. And I saw this cartoon a little while ago and it made me laugh. The evolution of COVID. And I think if you're like me, I kind of skipped straight to step two, where pants quickly became optional when we were all able to work from home for a while. But then that led to just kind of the dismantling of my effort, and eventually found it a bit tricky to get out of bed, and have spent way too many days probably in stage 4 where I'm curled up in the fetal position, just face down going, ugh, I'm just so done with all of this. And I'm sure many of you likely feel the same. But wherever you're at today coming into 2022, I just want you to know that's okay, right? It's okay to meet us where we're at. And hopefully throughout our presentation today, you're able to leave here with some increased hopefulness and optimism about the path forward, because we've talked about some basic things we can all do from the position of leadership that ultimately have a positive benefit on us, each other, and our organizations. But this is always a tricky format, right? Talking to a computer screen. And I just personally, I do a lot of keynote speaking, and I'd way rather be in person with you all. It's just much more personal. But in order to try to engage you a little bit, and we've got a really small but hopefully mighty crew today, I want to try to use some technology. And because there's just a few of us, your votes matter more. And so that's kind of exciting. And the technology is called Mentimeter. And so you can play along here if you're willing. So on the next slide, just to get us used to the technology, I've got a first question. And it's, what word best describes how you're feeling to start 2022? And how you do this is, if you got your cell phone handy, or if you're in front of a computer right now, which I assume you are because you're on the meeting, go to menti.com. So that's menti.com. And then when you get there, it should ask you to enter a code. And the code you're looking for is at the top of the screen, but I'll read it out here. It's 7435, and I'm doing this here too, 74352519. And if you hit submit, it'll ask you the question: what is one word that best describes how you're feeling to start 2022? And you can go ahead and enter that in there, and it should start populating one of those word clouds. So I'm going to enter in one myself. There we go. So we've got excited, we've got hopeful. Mine was fully clothed, which is a cheat. It's more than one word. And so with the evolution of COVID, I'm proud to say I am wearing pants today. They're not even Lulus, they're like real pants, although I still do believe Lulus are real pants. And I'm not going to show you because that's just creepy. But I appreciate you playing along here. So we've got some great answers coming in, right? We have optimistic, blessed, cautious, excited, hopeless, hopeful, bit drained. And then this word called languishing, which is getting a lot of attention thanks to a fellow by the name of Adam Grant, who did a tremendous TED Talk recently on the concept of languishing. And we see the nice diversity, right, in these responses, and literally a polar opposite between feeling hopeless and hopeful and maybe everything in between. And so with that, I just want you to know I appreciate your honesty. And we're going to meet you where you're at today. And I do hope by the end of this, we have an increased sense of optimism. There are things that we can do each day, despite our external circumstance, to have a positive benefit to us and to others. And it's also just nice to know the technology is working. So I appreciate your participation. All right. So we're going to try to keep this to 45 minutes. And then, as mentioned, I would love it if there's contributions in the chat throughout. So if you have questions as they arise, don't wait until the end. You can head in and pop those in there. But if you would prefer to wait until the end, that's just fine. Also, I will save time to make sure we get your questions answered. But by the end of our 45 minutes, what do I hope we've accomplished? I guess it's these three things. So I hope you leave here with a heightened understanding of what actually drives high performance at work. And I'm going to nerd out on you a bit with some data around that. So I'll share my own personal observations from the organizations I've worked with, but I really want to layer it with some data as to what it tells us. I want to talk a bit about this concept of psychological safety. We're going to define what that means. And ultimately, the last point is, once we know what it is, how do we enhance it? How do we create a culture of psychological safety that increases performance within our organizations? That's the goal. So that's where we're headed. Now, in my work, part of my practice is working with teams. And usually there's two different phone calls I get around this. So one phone call is, hey, we've got a team event coming up and we want to do some team building. Team's functioning good. We just kind of want to take it to the next level. So what options do we have? Can we do some work together? So that's one. And then I get the other call from time to time, which is, our team's in total dysfunction. Everything's horrible. People hate each other. We're way off the rails. help. And that as well is an interesting engagement. And so over the last 13 years, when working within organizations, I've supported teams that I say the good, the bad, and the ugly. And now that I'm out on my own, I'm getting to broaden that with other organizations. And I find the work just fascinating. And so just before, I thought, okay, how are good and bad teams reflected on Google Images? And so I typed in angry work team. And this is the first image that popped up on Google. And it made me laugh because I looked at this and I'm like, I've seen a lot of angry work teams, but that's like the best dressed one I've ever seen. And they've all got coffee, and you probably can't even see that on this like fake stock image flip chart, but there's a graph going up and to the right. And I'm like, what are they so mad about? That's usually a positive sign. But apparently, according to Google, this is what an angry team looks like. And then I Googled good work team or happy work team. And this is what I got, which was this like beautiful eclectic mix of people putting their hands in that are all just well groomed and happy and ready to go and build the world's greatest spreadsheet or something. But anyway, the teams that I've interacted with generally are not this polished. There's a lot of tension, conflict, dynamics, and there's just realness, right? Because we're filled with complex human beings. And so today I want to share a little bit about my experience working with good teams, working with dysfunctional teams, and maybe everything in between, and try to build it down to the very basics of what we can do as leaders to create higher performing organizations. All right. So first off, we should talk about what makes a high performance team. All right, let's do that. And I'm getting pretty caught up in this whole movement around the Canadian men's Canadian soccer team. It looks like they won again last night. So it's highly likely that they're going to be going to the World Cup in Qatar in just a few months here for the first time, I think, since 1986, which is pretty cool. And it got me thinking about the highest performing team you've ever been a part of. And I'd love to know, if we had time to talk about it, what that team was all about. But if you could just think about it for a second and reflect on the best team you've ever worked on, what made it so effective? And then if you could dive a little bit narrower into what is the one thing that made that team so special? If you had to boil it down to the one thing, what is it? And I'm going to go ahead and ask you to go back to your Menti. So if you've got your smartphone and you go back to that, you should see the question now there. And it actually allows you to put in, I guess, more than one word, because I gave you three options. You only have to put in one. But what is one important driver of team performance? And specifically, if you think back of the best teams you've ever worked on, what are some of the things that come to mind? So go ahead, take a second, pop that in the chat while I kind of take a chug of water, and we'll see what emerges. So we've got communication, we've got collaboration, which is a close cousin of communication. We see respect, trust, good humor. We see that word respect again, a great team leader. Honesty, yeah, just popped into there. Fantastic. Yeah, these are all fantastic responses. Just give it one more second to see what's coming through. We just saw integrity and accountability show up. Hey, and then psychological safety. Someone looked ahead in the presentation. Probably pretty easy to guess based off of the title, right? So this is one of those annoying exercises that speakers do where they ask you for something and then tell you that every answer is right. And that is the truth, because ultimately what I was asking you was to reflect on the teams you've been a part of. And when thinking about that, what mattered to you in terms of driving great outcomes? So there's no wrong answer to this question. That being said, there is a right answer to this question according to some research, and that's what we're going to get into. But I first want to talk about what emerged as, I think, just slightly the biggest word on here, and I didn't plant that, but it's trust. So trust is a little bit bigger. Communication is second, it looks like, and then we have kind of all the other ones with equal contribution. And trust is absolutely foundational to team performance. In my opinion, anytime I've seen a team that's completely dysfunctional and off the rails, it really comes down to a lack of two things when we get to the root of it. And first, it's a lack of trust, and often that's related to a lack of respect amongst the relative team members within the group. And we see both of those words heavily reflected in the contributions here. But the problem with trust, what's the problem with trust? Well, first off, you've got a real problem, I guess, if you're trying to do trapeze with a sumo wrestler. Don't know how you would ever even get into that situation. But the problem with trust is I find it difficult to develop, because trust is something that is built slowly over time through small contributions. Just like integrity, it takes a long, long time to build up that feeling of trust. And the other thing that's challenging with trust is that it's individual. The behaviors that ultimately help me feel trusting with other people are variable and different. And everybody on the line will also have a different feeling as it relates to what builds trust for you. But there's this concept that I quite like about when talking about building trust called the marble jar. And for those of you who are big fans of Brene Brown, she talks about the anatomy of trust, and she uses this metaphor as well. And I thought it was cool because I was listening to that and I was hearing her talk about the concept of the marble jar. And my daughter, who's in grade 4, her teacher is doing this exact same thing this year in their classroom. And so how it works is at the start of the year, the class came up with a set of what are called team commitments. And essentially what they are is specific behaviors that the whole class have collectively created that ultimately demonstrate how they want to show up this year in their classroom. And then every day when those things are demonstrated, the teacher calls them out, and the kid who demonstrated it gets to go up and pick a marble out of a jar and put it in the marble jar. And slowly, of course, over time, this builds up. And if they get it full, they get to have a bit of a party. So as an example, right before Christmas, they all got to go to a movie theater and watch the movie Encanto. And now I can't get that song, We Don't Talk About Bruno, out of my head because I think we've watched it 10,000 times in my house over the last month. But nevertheless, that's the idea, is trust is like a marble jar, right? It's a series of small actions in alignment with the behaviors that we've agreed to that matter to us that create it. But it takes a long, long time to build. And just like integrity, if you took a baseball bat to that marble jar, just one really bad action can bring the whole thing back down. And that's also what happens in their classroom, is if there's violations that are clear of the team commitments or the classroom commitments, as they call them, they take marbles back out of the jar. And it's a nice visual representation. And so I'd like you to kind of hold that image in mind here as we move forward and talk about high performance organizations, is that you really can't, in my opinion, have a high performance organization if it's not built on a foundation of trust. But in order to build a foundation of trust, you have to have pretty clear alignment on the behaviors and the commitments that you all uphold and demonstrate that consistently over time. And it's always moving, going up or down day to day as we re-audition for trust through our actions and behaviors. But what if there was a shortcut? Does that sound enticing? It's kind of a letdown because there really isn't a shortcut. But there's some new data on this that I think is really interesting. And of course, as a leadership super nerd, I would find that interesting. Some of you might just be rolling your eyes, but I want to expose you to this because I think it's pretty fascinating. And this is where we get into this jargony word called psychological safety. So this topic has been researched for decades, but it's only just started in the last couple of years to gain really big traction. And I'm curious how many of you have heard that term before, but where it really became popularized was at the end of 2019, I believe it was. Google had just finalized the largest study on organizational team performance internally within an organization that I've ever seen or that has been published to my knowledge. And what they did was they took 5 years and 180 different intact teams within the organization, and they studied them based on all these traditional performance metrics. So things like obviously results and KPIs, also innovation and invention. They looked at engagement scores and turnover and a bunch of kind of labor and talent statistics, basically all the traditional metrics you could think about. And then they categorized these teams and they ranked them, the best, kind of average, and then low performance teams. And then, doing only what Google knows how to do, they got super analytical and started to dive deep into what differentiated the great teams from the good teams, the average teams, and the low performance teams. All their research is for free online, and they've even got their training programs available for free, which is really cool. But ultimately what they uncovered through the research was these were the top 5 things that drive organizational performance. The first and foremost is, big shocker, this term called psychological safety. And they define that, it's hard to see it on the screen because it's so small, but that team members feel safe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other. Okay, we're going to come back to that in a second. To round it out, they had dependability, structure and clarity, meaning and impact. But the reason number 1 is in a different shade of teal, or whatever color we're going with here today, is not just because it's the first one. it was actually a prerequisite for top performance. So as an example, they found examples within teams that had high dependability, structure, clarity, meaning, and impact. But if it didn't have psychological safety, it never made it into the top third in terms of high performance. Subsequently, they did have examples where they had a high level of psych safety, but were missing pieces of 2 through 5, and it still was in the top quartile. They had no examples of top performance that did not have a foundation of psychological safety. And this then got them really excited about, hey, maybe we found the secret to high performance teams. And then there's a person called Amy Edmondson, who's probably sitting there saying, that's what I've been saying all along. So who Amy Edmondson is a Harvard professor and researcher who has been studying high performance teams for over 20 years. She started out kind of studying healthcare units, actually, and identifying which ones drove better patient care and better outcomes and greater accuracy in diagnosis and performance in surgeries and all of these great things. And then she took her work into the corporate world and started studying corporate teams. And through 20 years of research, she ended up coining the term psychological safety, because she didn't set out to identify what that was. Instead, she was identifying what separates great teams from good teams, just like Google was trying to do. And she then created the term because it was this thing that really wasn't defined. And the way that she defines it is in a very simple sentence: the belief that the work environment is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. Okay, so just going back to Google's definition, it's very similar. Team members feel safe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other. Here we have the belief the work environment is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. So what does that really mean? And how do we make this practical? Well, really what it's about is that kind of feeling like I can show up as my authentic self. I can be respectfully candid. We tell the truth. We don't leave anything on the table. We fully engage. We're passionate about it, but we always do it from this position of dignity and respect with each other. It's important to break this down in terms of what it's not and what it is, just so we have the understanding. And it's not about being nice, all right? And I'm not saying it's about being mean, so please don't take that away. And it's like, yeah, I went to this leadership talk and the guy told me to be mean. No, that's not the point at all. But it's more about being candid than it is about being nice. It's about being respectfully honest. It's those moments of truth where maybe you disagree with an important decision within the organization. It's not that you don't like the individual. It's just you think there's some risk with the direction that we're going in, but maybe there's a power dynamic and this person's your boss and they seem really bought into this. What do you do? Well, those cultures of psychological safety are ones where people still engage. And that's that demonstration of vulnerability where they tell a hard truth, even though it's uncomfortable. It's also not an individual personality trait. So I don't know how many of you have taken things like Myers-Briggs or DISC or, any other psychometric solution that's out there. There's hundreds of them these days. But there is no data to suggest, not that I've seen anyway, that certain personalities are more hardwired for psychological safety. And actually, there is data to suggest it emerges when there's greater diversity in the team. So you need to have that foundation of respect, but the more diverse perspectives we have, the better likelihood that there's actually going to be a culture whereby people feel that they can engage fully and have that sense of vulnerability that results in a collective feeling of safety amongst the team. And then the last thing is sometimes people look at this and think, whoa, psychological safety, being vulnerable, that's going to take some time. It's going to take some effort. That's not the way we do things. So am I going to have to decrease my performance standards based off of that? Well, it's actually the opposite, right? I mean, that's where the Google work is helpful because it quite clearly suggested that it's actually the #1 driver for performance within organizations. There's this fancy little model that Amy Edmondson likes to use. Don't really have the time to get into it in full detail because I kind of want to get into the whole, how do we build this? How do we enhance it stuff? But you see these 4 quadrants, and I think this is a good way of looking at it. And a question for you might be, thinking about your own organization, whatever that looks like, wherever you are now, where is yours today, right? So in the top right is where we want to be, where we have these high performance standards, but we have this incredible culture of psychological safety. And when we're in that place, I kind of think of that old Disney quote where it's kind of fun to do the impossible. It's like we're setting these huge challenges, these big goals, these aspirational targets, but it doesn't feel stressful. It actually feels energizing because we know that we're doing it in a culture that is safe to fail and is a lot of fun and has that entire foundation of dignity and respect across the team. That's where we want to be. On the bottom left, I almost don't even talk about the apathy zone too much because I don't know any organization today that has low performance standards. Just doesn't really exist. We just keep pushing them and pushing them. But ultimately, where it's low and low is everyone's just kind of hanging out and chilling, and it's just easy. And so we all just kind of check out. What's much more common though is not to be in the top right where we want to be, and not to be in the top low, which just generally doesn't exist too often. Much more commonly, we're in the top left or the bottom right. Okay, so the top left is comfort zone, which is almost like we've done a lot of work to build the culture that we want, which is great, but now we haven't turned up the temperature, right? And actually realized the benefits. And so people just become comfortable and cozy. And so these things need to be lumped together where we want high performance and big, big challenges, but we only do that and turn the temperature up when we know the culture can sustain it. But the most common scenario is when we turn the temperature up without making sure we have the culture that's healthy for it. And that's where we end up in the bottom right, which is the anxiety zone. I can't tell you how many people I work with in dysfunctional teams that are firmly implanted in the anxiety zone, where they feel like it doesn't matter what I do, I can never get ahead. It's a never-ending rat race. As soon as I deliver something, the expectations go up. It just gets harder and harder. The company keeps asking more and more and more. And the culture just erodes into a place where it's really toxic. And then we have all of these negative mental health impacts and a whole bunch of other stuff that I won't get into today, right? So ultimately, this is a real big problem when we have so many people living in the anxiety zone. But the opportunity, of course, is if we get up to that top right, we're not decreasing those performance standards at all. But now we're creating an environment where we can achieve them, and it actually is energizing instead of anxiety inducing. So I hope I've convinced you that this is worth looking into. I guess with the last little bit here that I've got, I want to talk a little bit about how we do this. And in order to do that, I want you to think about this question, and I'll tell you why in a minute. When do you feel you're most creative, you're most energized, maybe even you're most productive? All right. And I got some fun photos to prompt you up there. I'm going to give you options on this and ask you to go back to your Menti. All right. So here we go. When do you feel you're most creative and most energized? So here are your options. In the shower or bath, rub-a-dub-dub, while exercising, and I mean like actually enjoyable exercise, so commuting, and maybe that depends if you're listening to kind of the latest news on the pandemic or some soothing music, but ultimately commuting, at pants, oh God, at work, wearing pants. That's a nice Freudian slip. And then other, I'm so curious what it might be, but go ahead and just enter that in the Menti. We'll start seeing dots emerge to kind of where your answer is. But I'm curious, when do you feel you're most creative and most energized? I'll give you a minute on that while I take a swig of water, and then we'll move forward. Got a nice mix. I won't ask if you prefer showers or baths, but we've got 25 for bathing, and we've got 25 at work. And then we got a couple in the other category, which again, could be anything at all. And I'm really curious what those things are. And then we have some representation on commuting and exercising. Yeah, this is interesting, right? We've got a little bit of a mix here. And it's funny, right? Because you would think that ultimately the goal of an organization is to drive performance. And what this is starting to tell us is that, okay, that is still the top one, but we feel our most energized and our most creative often in places that isn't just our work. So why is that? And what's the common element here as to when we feel most creative and energized? And the answer to that question is actually buried in neuroscience. And really what it means is it comes down to when we're most creative, most energized, and ultimately most productive. It's when we're relaxed. All right. And I want to talk about why, but I need your engagement on this one too. And we're going to move quick just in the interest of time. So we're going on a road trip. All right. I need you all to join me. And it's a hypothetical road trip. And I see Christine on the line. So I think you've done this before, Christine. I can't remember what the answers were in that workshop when we went through it, but we'll see how this group compares to the one you were in before. But where are we going? California coast, the mountains, or Yorkton, Saskatchewan? So there are your choices. Choose wisely. I'll give you just a second. Where are we going on our hypothetical road trip today? All right. We've got 7 responses. Hey, there's a vote for Yorkton. All right. I like how maybe you waited until there was enough answers that we're still going to California, but I'm going to throw in that little Yorkton. All right, next one. We're going to move forward. So, okay, we're going to the California coast on our hypothetical road trip. What are we driving? A Cadillac Escalade, a Porsche 911, or a minivan? Your choice of minivan, though. All right, so just to spruce it up a bit. Oh, wow. Dead heat. All right. I am so curious if the same person who picked Yorkton also picked the minivan, but I just don't have that information. All right. So we've just narrowly squeaked out a Cadillac Escalade over the Porsche. All right. So we're hitting the Escalade. We're on our way to the California coast. And last question, what tunes are we pumping on the radio? Do we have Bon Jovi, Beyonce, Garth Brooks, or We Don't Talk About Bruno, which is certainly what I listened to and dropped off my kids this morning on the way to school. Okay, we got some Living on a Prayer. Oh, Encanto has hit the board. A little bit of Single Ladies. Okay, well, thank you for participating in this ridiculous exercise. All right, so good choices. We've got an Escalade on the way to the California coast, and we've got John Bon rocking on the radio. All right, so that's a pretty cool setting. I did ask this one time, and I remember, yeah, getting the answers. We're going to Yorkton in a minivan, listening to Sharon Lois and Bram. So I'm going to say this group is winning by comparison. All right, so what does this matter? All right, well, I want you to actually imagine that scenario. So look at this beautiful highway. Let's say, obviously, we've crossed the border. We're in warmer climates. We're driving down the coast. We're getting closer to California. We're having a great time, but we want to get there fast, right? Because it's beautiful and we're on vacation, and you know what, we got some 80s rock just pumping and all of the great memories that come back when we think about that in our beautiful Escalade, which is nice and comfortable. And so we don't even realize, but we're speeding and we're going a little bit fast, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we hear this sound of the siren kind of faintly coming up behind us, and we look in our rear view mirror and we see the red and blue blinkers. What happens to us in that moment? I want you to think about your body's response, right? What do we do? What do we say? I won't ask you to repeat that in the chat because that might get a little bit more than PG rated. But I want you to think about that experience in the moment as soon as you realize you're being pulled over by the police. That is the fight, flight, or freeze response in your body, right? And generally what happens is you clam up, right? You stress, you might say a couple choice words, your blood pressure starts boiling, your heart starts racing, you might actually stop breathing, your hands grip the steering wheel really tight and your entire body kind of clenches up and your vision narrows in on the look of those sirens, on the blinkers coming a little bit closer. And now I want you to think about that scenario as the siren gets louder, the car behind you gets closer, and all of a sudden that cop car pulls over into the passing lane and speeds past you to get that fancy minivan that was going a little bit faster listening to Encanto in front of you. Now what happens to your body? Right? This big sense of relaxation, right? Where we just sink back in our chair. We might not have even realized how fast our heart rate was, but it's slowly starting to regulate. We kind of loosen our grip on that steering wheel. We don't even realize we were sweating. You know, that blood pressure slowly starts to decrease, right? And we kind of sink back into that state of relaxation. And we're coming out now of that fight, flight, or freeze response. So why did I do this? And why does any of this matter? Well, ultimately, I want to make some connections to what I was talking about earlier. I started this talk by what drives high performance. And what the data is telling us is if we can create a culture of trust or psychological safety, that has the highest correlation to increasing performance in your organization. Now, we got to ask the question then, how do we create an environment of safety? And I want you to think about those moments when you felt really energized and creative. At the heart of that, what the neuroscience tells us is it's when we're relaxed. And for some of you, that might be at work. For some of you, it might be in the shower, it might be exercising, whatever. But what we want to do through our leadership and the actions and behaviors we demonstrate is to create a feeling of safety for other people. The feeling like you experience when the cop car goes past you, not the feeling like when the cop car is in the rear view and you're hearing the sirens. Really quickly, I didn't bring my lab coat today, and so I'm not going to nerd out too much on the neuroscience, but there's just some basics I want you to understand about what happens to the brain when it feels threatened. All right. So the brain is made up of 3 parts generally. I mean, it's way more complex than that. I'm going to keep this really simple. But the oldest part is this thing on the bottom left of the slide called the reptilian brain, or the brainstem, or the basal ganglia, or whatever you want to call it. And ultimately, its primary job is for survival. Okay, it's what kept us alive when being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, many, many years ago, and it still exists today. And it's the thing that ultimately, when it feels threatened, kicks the body into that fight, flight, or freeze response. Wrapped around it is this little thing called the limbic system, or the midbrain. And that's where our emotions live. The really critical part to all of this in the midbrain is that at the back of it is something called the amygdala. You don't have to remember any of this. But the amygdala is responsible for emotional regulation. And what it does is anytime there's stimulus that comes in, it does a quick analysis and it categorizes, and I'm drastically oversimplifying this, into two categories. Is this a threat or is this safe? And if it feels safe, we get that response like we're sinking back into the chair. If it categorizes it a threat, it alerts that reptilian brain, and it actually takes blood flow from the third part of the brain, which is the neocortex. The neocortex is this big part wrapped around the limbic system, and it's responsible for everything else. Logic, rationality, creativity, all of this good stuff lives in the neocortex. But the neocortex needs something to function, and that is blood flow. So in moments of stress or threat, what happens is the amygdala triggers it, and there is literally a loss of blood flow in your rational, creative, logical thinking part of your brain, and it pushes it down into the extremities of the body that looks like gripping the steering wheel, tightening up, saying a couple choice words, and getting ready to either fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, so that's your little neuroscience talk for the day. Why does any of this matter? Well, this is really important to understand because the last point of this is the brain can't differentiate between a physical threat and a social threat. So right now, if somebody intruded into my office and threatened my physical safety, my brain would have the same response as if somebody on this call made a highly discriminatory comment that had a conflict with my personal values. One is a comment made through a computer screen. Another is a physical threat in my actual environment, but the body's response will be the same. Think about just how often our behavior is creating social threats daily within our work environment, right? But yet there are ways and things that we can do as leaders in both our personal relationships and our work relationships that lead to a state of reward. Okay, and that's what I want to spend the last couple of minutes talking about, is giving you 3 stories and strategies that ultimately have very high correlation to creating an environment of safety for your people, and then ultimately resulting in increased organizational performance. All right, tale of a CEO. I'm actually going to skip this in the interest of time. Actually, no, I won't, because I think I'm going to reference it later. Big finger pointing. The worst CEO I've ever seen, and I won't get into the organization, kind of the history around this, but I just remember this experience so intensely, where I was asked to facilitate a pretty intense meeting with an executive leadership group, and it had about 60 days of lead up and a whole bunch of prep work. So I won't get into the background there, but I had done a lot of work coming into this meeting, and we were going to ultimately go in there with a very clear objective and come out of there with a decision on a really, really big thing. And my job was to facilitate the team through this. And I gathered representative data from each individual member of the executive team in advance and prepared a nice summary overview of the recommendations, so it could be a really focused conversation. And I remember we had 4 hours to this meeting, and I walk in, I had it all laid out. I was nervous, excited, all the good things, but I felt prepared. And we sat down, and I started to do my opening, and I didn't get 30 seconds into the opening before the CEO interrupted me and said, "Brett, stop talking." And then he looked at every single member of his leadership team and pointed his finger individually and looked them in the eye and said, "I am so disappointed in every single one of you." And then for the next 2 minutes, he went on just an angry tirade about how he couldn't believe how terrible these recommendations were and how little thought everybody went into all of this. And for the rest of that meeting, the air was completely sucked out of the room and nobody else said a thing. That is the opposite of psychological safety, right? It was in that moment with that finger pointed that I knew this team will never, ever recover so long as this leader is in place. So what do we do differently? Well, I mean, obviously do the opposite of that. And let's try not to do some finger pointing. But 3 practical strategies. 1, create a sense of certainty. 2, demonstrate vulnerability. And 3, destigmatize failure. And Monica, thank you. I see your chat contribution. Really appreciate that. This sounds like would also be applicable to families and social groups. Super important, especially given our last couple of years. Absolutely. I would argue we have been living in a sustained period of threat state for the last 2 years. And I'm going to link that to this first point here around creating a sense of certainty. Where that information comes from is a place called the Neuro Leadership Institute, which is an organization that I've partnered with a bit in my education and background. And they do fascinating things because they actually study the brain's response to how we interact in a work environment. And they've come up with their criteria for ultimately what is the number 1 driver of reward state, as they call it, and a number 1 driver of threat state. And the number 1 thing that they've identified is certainty. If you can provide certainty/clarity for people, that brings down the threat state and increases the state of safety and reward. We have been living, to your point, Monica, in a period of sustained uncertainty for 2 years. I would argue we've likely been going around just in a perpetual state of threat. The reason I put this photo up here was I've been on 1 airplane in 2 years, which was to a very strange family reunion in rural Manitoba, which I won't talk about again. But I did go on airplanes all the time prior to the pandemic. I took this at about 2 in the morning in the Toronto Pearson airport because we were on a flight delay. And it looks like people are dead on the floor. They were just sleeping because they were so exhausted. But what was amazing about this experience, and I've been in so many flight delays over the years, is, you know, that moment when they announce there's going to be a delay. Oh, and it's a maintenance issue and we don't exactly know the problem. And so we'll update you when you can. Well, that's that lack of certainty. I don't know when I'm getting home. I don't know what's coming next. All of these things start to trigger. Well, in this situation, this flight attendant was amazing. Every 10 minutes, she came on the intercom and would literally say, I don't have any information, but I'm going to tell you every 10 minutes if I do have information or I don't have information. And every 10 minutes, on the 10 minutes, she showed back up on the microphone. And it allowed people to relax enough that they literally fell asleep on the floor. And so what are things that you can do? This is the number 1 recommendation I would make to help create an environment of safety. Give people clarity, right? Give them the information you do have. Even if you don't have the specific details, letting them know you don't goes a very, very long way. And then frequent feedback for people. Clear as kind is something Brene Brown talks about, right? It's not about the message always necessarily needs to be positive, but it's more about letting people know where they stand. The more transparent we can be respectfully, and the more certainty we can provide, the higher level of psychological safety. That's point number 1. Next one. I know I'm moving quick here, and I'm probably going to run a little bit over 12:45, so hang in if you don't mind. I haven't seen any questions come through, though, and we did kind of bank 15 at the end for Q&A. So we might cut this Q&A a little bit shorter, but still do ask questions. The next one is demonstration of vulnerability. And as a leader, if you lead people within an organization, I would argue you got to go first on this one. And I want to share a really humbling moment here. So why did I put a picture of a school up there? I think you met my daughters earlier on the land acknowledgement slide, but this is one of the most humbling moments, I would say, of my parenting life. And it happened at my daughter's kindergarten parent-teacher interview. So my now 10-year-old, when she started kindergarten, she's always dealt with, quite a bit of anxiety. And I would say just a lack of resiliency around learning. Anytime she's trying to learn something new, she immediately shuts down if she doesn't get it right the first time. And that looks like her running to her room, slamming the door and shouting like, I'm sick of this and I'm never going to try this again. Dad, I will never try that again. And I was super worried about how this was going to show up in the classroom. And so I remember after like the 6 weeks or whatever it was into the school year, being pretty anxious to go to that parent-teacher interview. And I walked in there and asked the teacher, so how is she showing up in the class and how are you dealing with this when she demonstrates that behavior? And the teacher just looked at me and she shook her head and said, I've never seen her do that. And I couldn't believe it. I was actually mad. I was like, why does she do this at home, but she doesn't do that here? And then the teacher flattened me with a question. And she said, how often does your daughter see you make a mistake? I came from a father who I adore, and he's a wonderful human being, but he was my ball coach growing up. And we literally started every single ball practice with the same line. He would sit us down after we did our calisthenics, and he would look us all in the eye and he would say, all right, boys, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. We literally had to practice perfect. So I grew up from a long line of perfectionists and have become one myself. And in that moment, I realized that I am never letting that be seen. And then the teacher went on to say, I spend the entire first month of the year just making mistakes in front of the kids. I draw outside the lines, I'll spell things wrong, I'll accidentally drop something, whatever it is. And I just do that to try to create an environment to let them know it's okay when we're learning to make mistakes. If your people never see you make a mistake, they will never think it's okay to make a mistake. And so that's what number 2 is all about here, is that demonstration of vulnerability, right? And so acknowledging those mistakes, I don't mean go intentionally make them, but you're going to because you're human. And instead of trying to cover those up, embrace, I guess, that old Leonard Cohen song, right? It's the cracks that let the light in. Let that light be seen because it de-risks it for everybody else. The last point on here, I put set clear boundaries. You got to do that in a way that's not exposing information that feels like a violation of your privacy, right? Boundaries without, or vulnerability without boundaries, I say, is not vulnerability. That's Brene Brown's line. And ultimately, that has to be your flavor. So put good privacy boundaries on it, but definitely seek opportunities to let your team know it's okay to make mistakes. And that's really linked to the third one, which is destigmatizing failure. I'll just summarize quickly. I talked about a terrible CEO earlier. Well, I've seen some great ones. And I remember going into another offsite facilitation with a similar executive group with a similar mandate and a very difficult conversation and outcome that they were going to have. And we got into the discussion. And at one point, I could tell one of the executives who owned a pretty big business, he was nervous and he was kind of shaking. And I knew something was up. And I kind of paused and said, do you have anything you'd like to share? And I could tell he was in this moment of conflict of, do I say it? Do I say it? Do I say it? And then he did. And what he shared was just a tragic outcome of some really terrible business results that were happening within his specific business. And he came clean with what was really going on. And then, of course, everybody looked to the CEO. How's he going to respond to this? And in that moment, I'll never forget, it wasn't the finger pointing. This CEO was hands nice and gently kind of in front. And his first words out were, thank you so much for telling the truth. And that in that moment was psychological safety, right? And then what came from that was this incredible discussion of how the business was going to get back on track. And it became about attacking the problem, not attacking each other. And that's really what it's about, is positively recognizing the truth, viewing failure as diagnostic. We're actually stronger as a result of the failure because we have new information that we've learned. And now we can take that forward, asking the question, what did we learn from this experience? So we're actually better as a result. Amy Edmondson has a book called The Fearless Organization. I think it's somewhere on my shelf back there. This is her blueprint for creating psychological safety. If you pick that book up, it will guide you through specifically a nice toolkit of ultimately how you apply this within your organizations. I've just summarized it down to those 3 things. If you can create certainty, if you can acknowledge your mistakes by demonstrating vulnerability, and you can respond in a way that de-risks or destigmatizes failure, you are going to create an environment of psychological safety around you. And what the data now tells us, that is the #1 driver for increasing organizational performance. So with that, I think I'll leave you with my closing quote. Small ripples make big waves. It's on my website, and it's kind of what I stand for, is this doesn't need to be big stuff, right? Just like the marble jar, it is daily actions and behaviors that lead to a lifetime of trust being accumulated over time. And when you do that, you may not even realize the impact that you're having on others, but it will be immense. Just to your point, Monica, in the chat, of that teacher, right? Choosing daily to just de-risk things for the kids by making mistakes and letting those be seen. I think about that teacher all the time. She will never fully know just how much of a difference she's made in my daughter's life, in my life, and every other kid who is in her classroom's life. But it's those small ripples that ultimately over time make those big waves. So I'll leave that with you. Here's me. I post weekly leadership videos on my website. So if you want to follow along, please feel free to do that. If you ever want to chat about these topics, you can reach out. But I would just thank you so much for your engagement and participation today. And I would love to take any questions if you got them. I've got another 10 minutes here. I know some of you maybe have to drop, but we'll take your questions. And then I think we'll turn it back to Trina here to close things off. So yeah, let's just go to the chat. So I got a few things in here. Let me just catch up. All right, Monica. Oh, sorry. A few more. Oh, thanks. Yeah, just some nice recognition. Really appreciate the kind comments. That's great. Monica, the necessity of failure is most fundamentally seen in science. We test hypotheses and take the results and add to our knowledge and try again, searching for the truth. This fits in work. Yes, exactly. It is necessary. And I love that language. It's not about getting it perfect or right. It's about getting closer to the truth, right? Always building on it based on our past experiences. And if we don't fail, we just don't have that diagnostic, right? And so we come out stronger when we actually have those experiences. So I really like that. Thanks, Graham, as well for the comment. Jason, great talk. Once psychological safety has been compromised, can it really ever be repaired? Even if vulnerability and destigmatizing failure becomes the new norm, the legacy effects of that compromised safety can be powerful. Can it really be overcome? Not commonly. Is my short answer to that, Jason. It is exceptionally rare to overcome and rebuild that. And generally, it doesn't work without a change to the leader, in my experience. So I'm trying to think, have I ever seen an example? It's all in a continuum. And so what I'll often do, and I know this is a bit of a technical answer, and just so it's practical for everyone out there, if you want to learn more about this and not have to spend a ton of money, Amy Edmondson's website, it's called thefearlessorganization.com. For free, you can take a 3-minute, 7-question self-assessment on your existing team, and that'll give you, based on her criteria, your current score around the current state of psych safety within your group. For I think $20 a person, you can actually have that done as a confidential assessment within your team. But of course, I always say handle that with caution, because you still have to facilitate that, right? And people will maybe come out with some really hard things. So often the only way that I've seen it, Jason, where there's been like a really big step change on the continuum when it's been really low, is when it's partnered with assessment data that takes contribution respectfully and anonymously from the full team. And then there's a facilitated process whereby which we can expose that to the group, and then they collectively commit to improving the culture. And that takes a leader, right? And the problem, of course, is if the leader is the byproduct of the bad culture, they're probably not super motivated to look in the mirror and realize what they're doing. And so in cases like that, if there's no self-awareness on the leader, I would argue there's zero chance of improvement for psychological safety without swapping out the leader. If the leader does have that moment of reflection and awareness that, wow, I really want this to improve because there's some cultural things here, and maybe there's some things with my behavior, now we stand a chance. But that's where we need data and to handle that with care. So technical answer, but that's my honest response there. Just taking a look here. Yeah, thanks. Some more really nice comments. Tanis, Chinese proverb, courtesy of Wally Ma. Yeah, Northridge, awesome. Trust, like a wine glass, once broken, can never be perfectly repaired. Yeah, and then you can't drink wine out of it, which is like double bad. So that's really beautiful. Japanese, fill cracks in a bowl with gold. Nice. Look at all this wisdom. Wisdom on a Thursday. This is fun. The point of the proverb is to treat trust as a valuable, fragile entity. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it is something that once fractured can maybe never fully be repaired. And the problem, of course, with it is maybe just like drinking wine, although these days I have lots of practice in that. Takes a lot of sips before maybe where you get where you want to be with wine, but you drop the glass, it's just one quick little action and it's shattered. So I don't know how much wisdom is in that, but it takes a lot more to consume than it does to drop and shatter, just like trust. So yeah, there, nerding out on the wine talk today. What type of simple exercises or discussions could you do with the team to help build psychological safety? Great question, Colton. It's a bit of a catch-22, but if you want to start somewhere, I think my slides are still being shared. I'm going to go back to this funky grid that I showed earlier. And a good place to maybe start is pop this up on a screen with your team. And just first, you probably have to explain what psychological safety is. I hope the slides get distributed, but again, you can go to Amy Edmondson's website as well. But ultimately, pop this up and just say, hey, I want to talk about these 4 quadrants. Where do we think we are as a group? And then have a conversation a bit about when we're in the top right, because we're always moving, right? Based on, pressures and expectations and targets and, all the stressors in our lives, we're always moving on this model. But I hope that your team has at some point felt what it's like to be in the top right. what was present for us when we were in the top right? What were we doing? How were we behaving, right? And maybe if you're in the anxiety zone or somewhere else, what were some of the things that, influenced us negatively to shift out? And what are some things that have helped us get back at times? Having that conversation just with one slide like this can be a really powerful starting point to identify collectively as a team what it means to you to create psychological safety. So that's one thing that you can do for free right away that I think might be helpful. The catch-22, of course, is if you have a team that has really low psychological safety, they may not be honest in that conversation, right? Because the psych safety is low, they may not fully engage and tell the truth. So it might take a few cracks at this to let them know it's safe to tell the truth here. The intent of this is to build a stronger, higher performing culture and facilitate with respect anytime somebody brings up a contribution. You really want to recognize that. So that would be my guidance on that one. Any other questions? Yeah, Monica, it's also important to know that there are people and resources to help for teams, for individuals. We need to know that acknowledging that we need some help is the first step. We can't solve all of these issues on our own. And why would we think we can? Absolutely, right? Like this is really in the way that I've talked about it, it is about culture. And the way I define culture is the way we do things. And that's collectively, right? It's just if you held up a mirror to all of our actions and behaviors, what's reflected back defines your culture. But you can't change it for anybody else aside from yourself. That's the only way that we can influence it. And so if the group wants to change the culture, it really does take that team and group commitment. And there is support out there. The last reference, the Mental Health Commission of Canada has free resources on their website also for organizations around how to create cultures of psychological health and safety, which gets more into the mental wellness conversation. But check that out too, if you're looking for some free resources to start activating within your company. Awesome. Well, with that, I know we're right bumping up against the hour. So really appreciate everybody joining today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Trina.
Thank you, Brett. What a wonderful session today. Really appreciate that. Great engagement as well. And I'll let you know, I am one of those individuals that are definitely going to California, listening to Bon Jovi for sure.
Perfect.
Well, that leaves me to thank you, Brett, for the advice and insight you've shared today that our members can put to work in their businesses right away. Reminder that we are on the lookout for great presenters like Brett on topics you care about. So if you have any suggestions on future topics or speakers, please send me an email at events@saskatoonchamber.com or give me a call, 306-664-0705. Love to get some suggestions on that.